Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Noemi Smolik. I am art historian and art critic based in Berlin, but I am of Czech origin. I grew up here in Prague, and I am co-founder of the platform with the name Hope Recycling Station. We are since 6 years around organizing lecture and discussion and studio visits and so on. And now we are the initiator of this symposium. This symposium with a little poetic title, Made Voices Be Heard. For some years now, question of colonialism, its legacy, and the way how to address this legacy have been one of the central themes of contemporary art, international contemporary art. But while artists and theoreticians from global south and north are represented in exhibition, symposia, and debates on this topic, representatives from countries that were subject to the sphere of influence of former Soviet Union are meistens simply not present. Therefore, we ask, why the global debate on colonialism, post-colonialism, and racism paid hardly any attention to the experience of people of this country? And further, why a supposedly global knowledge about colonialism, post-colonialism, and racism, again, produced predominantly in West Europe and the USA, is missing the inclusion of the experience of the people from these regions, as witnessed in the current post-colonial debate. From about 60 participants of the symposium about this topic during the Berlin Biennial 2022, curated by the artist Kader Attia, there was no one speaker, or maybe if one, coming from this region. Therefore, again, it is time for the people of Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia to raise their voice. This is why the title, Make Voices Be Heard, decolonial reflection on power and racism of Central and East Europe and Central Asia. This symposium is intended to be a platform for voices that have so far not been heard or only insufficiently heard within the global debate on this topic. Voices that will ask to what extent the terminology and the epistemology developed predominantly in West Europe and the USA can be applied to these countries. And why the global debate today has been based on a clear dichotomy between colonized and colonizer, between perpetrator and victims, the situation in this country is more complicated and complex. The crisis before the war and during and after, or during the war in Ukraine, released a gaze of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe held by the countries of Western Europe that cannot be called anything other than asymmetric. While the Western countries tried to respond to security needs of the colonial power of Moscow, little attention was paid to the needs for security, respect, and self-determination of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Therefore, again, how is it that the experiences of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia are hardly taken into account in Western Europe, and that the knowledge, like the global theory of post-colonialism and racism, that is supposedly binding for all, is produced without including the experiences of the people of these countries? How is it that the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas speaks after 1989 of a catch-up revolution in relation to Central and Eastern Europe, as if the people of these countries have some catching up to do? Are they not, in contrast to the people in Western countries, richer of some experiences? Because they experience both kinds of systems, the Soviet socialism and the new Western capitalism. And how is it that Western scholars can declare themselves expert on, for instance, Russian avant-garde without speaking Russian, while they would look at a Russian or Czech scholar who would declare himself an expert on, for instance, US American abstract expressionism without speaking English? Therefore, again, the question, to what extent is this Western gaze on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and also Central Asia colonial in its nature? And it is not time to start to decolonize also this asymmetric oriented gaze as well. But in reverse, the gaze of the Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia on the countries of Western Europe is also characterized by an asymmetry. Since the emergence of modernity, which concept was created in Western Europe, this means a concept based on Eurocentrism, chauvinism, racism, and progressivism, these countries have been all too willing to undergo a process of modernization and therefore subject modernization that declare almost all local tradition of knowledge, whether of aesthetic knowledge, social knowledge, or religious knowledge, to be underdeveloped and therefore subject of elimination. This process has been particularly brutal in Russia since Peter the Great, since beginning of the 17th century, taking almost grotesque forms in the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. In 1901, the painter Ivan Yakovlevich Bilibin reported in the art magazine Mir Iskustva on an exhibition of Russian folk art in Moscow, which, however, didn't show Russian folk art, of which at that time were enough on the countryside, but objects specially made for the exhibition based on the South German model, painted with alpine landscapes and decorated with antlers. Also, the Russian folk art had to look like the Western folk art. Therefore, it is justified when Alexander Etkin, and Alexander Etkin is one of our speakers, speaks about intercolonization I prefer the term self-colonization in case of Russia. But how did this process of modernization and of self-colonization proceed in the countries of Central Europe? By adopting the concept of modernity, Russia also adopted the colonial thinking, as Marina Tlostanova, one of our next speakers, rightly pointed out. We cannot talk about colonialism without modernism. And so Russia adopted this colonial thinking, and colonized its neighbors in the West, the Poles in the West, and people in the South and on the border to Asia. And now Russia started colonial war against Ukraine. So Russia appears in a double role, as a culturally self-colonized country and at the same time as a colonizer of non-Russian people who were and still are considered in many cases undeveloped. One of the few who became aware of Russian double role, and this is interesting, was the writer Mikhail Fyodorovich Dostoevsky. Quote, "In Europe, we were hangers-on and slaves, whereas in Asia, we shall go as masters." There is no need to emphasize that Dostoevsky was not exactly loved by the Russian elite for such statements. But in his book Age of Anger, in which he deals with the consequences of culture modernization, colonization in India and in Muslim world, the Indian-born post-colonial thinker Pankaj Misra considers Russia to be the first country to undergo this process of modernization. Quote, "By producing disaffected people and radicals as if on an ensemble line, through the modernization, Muslim countries followed a pattern set by Russia. The first country in which autocrats had called for a rendezvous with modernity." But unlike the Russian elite, Misra considers Dostoevsky, who he quotes repeatedly in his book, to be the very first thinker to be aware of the consequences of this kind of modernization and self-colonization. More than a century ago, Dostoevsky was already speaking about the tragic dilemma of a society that had, quote, "absorbed the European way of life with every pore, only to learn the lesson that it will never be truly European." And this kind of disappointment of existential dimension, so Dostoevsky, results in feeling of rootlessness, emptiness, meaninglessness, futility, and humiliation, all feelings that could turn into self-hatred and aggression. What the foresight if we consider Putin's aggressive behavior, which is supported by a large part of Russian population? And what about countries of Central Europe? What traces were left behind in these countries by the all too great willingness to subordinate themselves to the concept of modernity that had been developed in Western Europe? Where is the aggressive behavior of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and the Polish leader of the PACS party, Jarosław Kaczynski, coming from? So you see the question of colonialism, post-colonialism, and racism in these countries is much more complicated, because in these countries we don't know, not have the simple opposition, colonizer on one side, colonized on the other. Russia and Soviet Union and today Russian Federation can be both. But what about the legacy of colonialism in the countries of Central Europe? Although they are not free of colonial thinking and racism, even if they did not have colonies. That is why Joanna Warsza, the next speaker, speaks of a coloniality without colonies. So for this symposium, we invited, and I am very proud of it, really a fantastic group of people to discuss all these questions. We have three thinkers with Caucasian, Russian, and Polish background. Sorry. And we have, following Madina Tlostanova's statement, quote, due to the Western epistemic monopoly, until now, the only way of entering the spheres of philosophy, historiography, sociology, or other social sciences for indigenous people in many parts of the world has been exclusively through literature and art. Also, following this statement, we invited artists, filmmaker, and theater maker with Uzbek, Slovakian, Georgian, Roma, and Buryat background to introduce their projects dealing with this topic. But before we start, one more remark. As I said, you cannot talk about colonialism without talking about racism and also slavery. The symposium will take place in this beautiful old town of Prague. Prague was one of the largest and richest cities in Europe in the early Middle Age. And do you know where this wealth came from? Mostly from the slave trade. In the early Middle Age, Prague was one of the largest and most important slave trading center in Europe.